With the formation of the African Association in 1788, the age of African exploration had begun. While trade with the continent had thus far primarily been conducted on its coasts, the association now hoped to penetrate into the interior, discovering the source of the River Niger and the mythic city of Timbuktu. Whilst Mungo Park was making his journey from the west, the association agreed on a new plan. They would send a man across the Sahara to discover the continent's mysteries. This is the story of Friedrich Hornemann and his journey to the Kingdom of Fezzan. Friedrich Conrad Hornemann was born on the 15th of September 1772 in the northern German city of Hildesheim. He spent his youth reading accounts of the exploration of the Americas, and these no doubt left a deep impression on the young boy. Despite this, he would initially enroll in the University of Göttingen, studying to become a Christian minister just like his father. A full 4 years were spent in this manner, but just before his graduation, Hornemann would make a decision that drastically altered the course of his life. In 1795, he asked his professor to introduce him to Sir Joseph Banks, an influential member of the African Association, hoping that Banks would sponsor him to explore the unknown regions of Africa. The African Association, founded in 1788, was a group of various members of British high society, and they sought to promote the exploration of the African interior. They held a particular interest in finding the source of the River Niger, as well as the city of Timbuktu that was said to stand on its banks. Various explorers had already undertaken this mission, but so far none had succeeded. And so, in 1796, Friedrich Hornemann was called to meet with Sir Joseph Banks. Early in the year 1796, Mr. F. Hornemann offered himself to the committee of the Society for this service. He appeared to be young, robust, and, in point of constitution and health, suited to a struggle with different climates and fatigues. In his manner and conversations he displayed temper, acuteness, and prudence. He was well apprised of the dangers and difficulties of the enterprise he was to engage in, and showed a spirit and zeal for the undertaking, which strongly recommended him as a proper person to be employed for the carrying it into effect. With Banks's approval, Hornemann was sent back to his university, but this time with a different purpose. As the explorer Mungo Park was currently attempting to reach the Niger by way of Western Africa, Hornemann was to try the journey from the north, and so a few months were spent in the study of Arabic, as well as in various other fields that would prove useful in his exploration. In the May of 1797, Hornemann would return to England and make preparations to depart for Cairo. As the French Revolutionary War was currently underway, he was forced to wait for a passport before his journey could begin. Once this was granted, Hornemann set off for Paris, where he was well received by its intellectual class, and they would help him obtain connections with some of the leading merchants of Cairo who traded with the remote regions of Africa. In late September, Hornemann arrived in Cairo. He planned to spend a few months in the city to refine his Arabic, as well as to observe the customs of the Maghrebis who he would be dealing with in his travels. In this time, he took the opportunity to form connections with the local merchants, and learned they were soon planning to travel along with some returning pilgrims to Fezzan. Hornemann resolved to join them, but this plan faced a dire setback when, in the spring of 1799, the French fleet arrived on the Egyptian coast. Sensing a coming conflict, the members of the caravan quickly dispersed, and the Europeans living in Cairo were confined to its castle to protect them from the irate locals. This stalemate would not last for long, as in late July the French captured the city of Cairo. Luckily, Hornemann would make the acquaintance of Claude-Louis Berthollet and Gaspard Monge, two French intellectuals who were traveling with the army and appreciated Hornemann's mission. Soon, they would schedule a meeting between Hornemann and their general, Napoleon Bonaparte. He received me with every mark of attention and goodness. His regard for science and esteem of learned men are too well known to render it necessary for me to expatiate on these high qualities. He promised me protection, he offered me money or whatever was requisite to my undertaking, and he directed the necessary passports to be prepared for me. With Napoleon's backing, Hornemann was released, and began to renew his connections with the members of the caravan who were slowly returning to the city now that the situation had stabilized. Now, however, his journey faced a much bigger problem. To travel as a Christian will perhaps be impracticable for at least 5 years to come, for it is incredible how deep and strong an impression the expedition of the French has made on the minds of the pilgrims to and from Mecca. Dispersed to their several homes, they will carry an aggravated prejudice against Christians far and wide, and to the very heart of Africa. Not willing to abandon his journey, Hornemann's only other option would be to make the journey as a Muslim. Luckily, he had learned in his studies that this was no monolithic culture. Muslims throughout the world were known to have different manners and customs, and so he would likely be able to pass himself off as one just by knowing their religious ceremonies and prayers. Hornemann would also gain the assistance of Joseph Frendenberg, a German living in Cairo who Hornemann had initially employed as an interpreter. More than 10 years ago, he had been forced to convert to Islam. By now, he had made the pilgrimage to Mecca 3 times, and was fluent in both Arabic and Turkish. Frendenberg agreed to join the expedition, and would no doubt prove a great assistant. Soon, the final members of the caravan had returned to Cairo, and on the 5th of September, 1798, they would depart, beginning their journey across the Sahara. The monotonous kettle drum of our sheik awakened us before the rise of the sun, with summons to proceed on our journey. I had not underrated the difficulties of the journey. I was aware that many must arise, especially affecting myself, never having before traveled with a caravan, and being little acquainted with the customs and manners of those who composed it. We had traveled from daybreak till noon, and no indication appeared of halt or refreshment, when I observed the principal and richest merchants gnawing a dry biscuit and some onions as they went on, and I was then for the first time informed that it was not customary to stop during the daytime but in cases of urgent necessity. This was soon remedied by the hospitality of some Arabs who were riding near me, and who invited me to partake of their provisions. Soon after sunset, our sheik gave the signal for halting, and we pitched our tents. My dragoman, or interpreter, might even in Europe have passed for a good cook, and from remains of the provision which our hospitable friends at Cairo had supplied, was preparing an excellent supper, when an old Arab of Aguila, observing his preparations, and that myself was unemployed, addressed me nearly as follows: "Thou art young, and yet dost not assist in preparing the meal of which thou art to partake. Such, perhaps, may be a custom in the land of infidels, but is not so with us, and especially on a journey. Thanks to God we are not, in this desert, dependent on others, as are those poor pilgrims, but eat and drink what we ourselves provide, and as we please. Thou oughtest to learn everything that the meanest Arab performs, that thou mayest be enabled to assist others in cases of necessity. Otherwise, thou wilt be less esteemed, and being of less value than a mere woman, and many will think that they may justly deprive thee of everything in thy possession, as being unworthy to possess anything." This remonstrance was not thrown away. I immediately assisted in everything that was not beyond my force, and proportionally gained on the good opinion and esteem of my fellow travelers, and was no longer considered as a weak and useless idler in their troop. The day after departure, the caravan arrived at the oasis of Wadi el-Natrun. They would stop here to gather water, when suddenly a group of Bedouin bandits appeared on the horizon. When the bandits retreated, the caravan would seize the opportunity, and immediately set off before the bandits could formulate plans for an attack. The caravan spent the evening camped at the foot of a hill. They lit no fire, and took other precautions to avoid being detected. Luckily, this strategy worked, and the caravan continued on the following morning unmolested. After a few more days of travel, they would reach Umesogere. Hornemann describes the town as small and with few inhabitants. Only around 30 men were employed in its defense. There were a number of low houses built of stone, and thatched with the leaves of date trees. But despite the inhabitants' apparent poverty, they received the caravan with warm hospitality. Almost the whole village came to help water the camels, or to do whatever else was required. The caravan would rest here for a few days before departing for the nearby Siwa oasis. Siwa is a small independent state. It acknowledges, indeed, the Grand Sultan Paramount, but it pays him no tribute. Siwa is built upon, and round, a mass of rock, in which, according to tradition, the ancient people had only caves for their habitation. Indeed, the style of building is such that the actual houses might be taken for caves. They are raised so close to each other that many of the streets, even at noon, are dark, and so intricate that a stranger cannot find his way into or out of the town, small as it is, without a guide. The people of our caravan compared Siwa to a beehive, and the comparison is suitable, whether regarding the general appearance, the swarm of its people crowded together, or the confused noise, or hum and buzz from its narrow passages and streets, and which reach the ear to a considerable distance. The territory of Siwa is of considerable extent. Its chief produce consists in dates, which, from their great quantity and excellent flavor, render the place proverbial for fertility among the surrounding Arabs of the desert. Each inhabitant possesses one or more gardens, making his relative wealth, and these it is his whole business to water and cultivate. They are watered by many small streams of salt or sweet water, falling from the bordering rocks and mountains, or issuing from springs rising in the plain itself. Siwa was an ancient town, and held many great ruins that caught Hornemann's interest. Chief among these was a large structure, which he had been told was built by the town's former infidel occupants to hold their councils. Hornemann visited the ruin 3 times, and proposed that it was possibly the temple of Jupiter Ammon, where Alexander spoke to the oracle of Amun-Ra, and was pronounced as the deity's son. But Hornemann's research was cut short, as his interest in the site drew suspicion from the locals. They would soon confront him, saying, "Thou undoubtedly art yet a Christian in thy heart, else why come so often to visit these works of infidels?" Before the situation turned dire, Hornemann chose to abandon his exploration of the temple. For the remainder of the caravan's stay in Siwa, he would instead visit the town's various catacombs, which were much more remote and free from prying eyes. Unfortunately, these tombs had already been thoroughly raided by locals searching for hidden gold. The scattered remains of mummies could still be seen around the sites, but they were in very poor condition. After 8 days of rest, the caravan would depart. But after just a few days of travel, they were suddenly approached by some of the people of Siwa, who came to inform them that an Arab horde was coming to raid the caravan. The Siwans resolved to come to their defense, and informed the caravan that their army was already on the way. The caravan's sheikh decided it would be best for them to hold their ground, and the men spent the night bracing for an attack with weapons ready. The next morning, they could see the army of Siwa approaching, but rather than coming to their assistance, they seemed instead to be preparing to attack the caravan. A messenger went forward to question their intentions, and brought back the cryptic reply that the caravan had nothing to fear. The Siwan army halted, and invited the merchants to a conference, to which Hornemann sent Frendenberg, the German translator, to see what was occurring. Frendenberg soon returned, but he was in a state of absolute panic, and Hornemann rushed to meet with him. Before Hornemann could even ask what had happened, Frendenberg shouted out, "Cursed be the moment when I determined upon this journey. We are both of us unavoidably lost men. They take us for Christians and spies, and will assuredly put us to death." He then ran to the baggage, and armed himself with Hornemann's rifle and pistols. Hornemann immediately scolded Frendenberg for his cowardice, and told him that acting in this manner would only make him appear even more guilty. He reminded Frendenberg that he had nothing to hide, as he was a genuine Muslim. The only one under threat was Hornemann himself. Frendenberg retorted that he would regret his boldness. As Hornemann could see that fear had completely consumed Frendenberg, making him unable to think straight, he would proceed alone towards the assembly, unarmed, but with a firm and steady gait. I entered the circle, and offered the Mahometan salutation, "Assalamu alaikum," but none of the Siwans returned it. Some of them immediately exclaimed, "You are of the new Christians from Cairo, and come to explore our country." I answered nothing to this general clamor, but sat down and directed my speech to one of the chiefs, whose great influence I knew, and who had been often in my tent whilst at Siwa. "Tell me, brother," said I, "hast thou ever before known 300 armed men take a journey of 3 days, in pursuit of 2 men who dwelt in their midst for 10 days, who had eaten and drank with them as friends, and whose tents were open to them all? Thyself hast found us praying and reading the Koran, and now thou sayest we are infidels from Cairo, that is, one of those from whom we fly. Dost thou not know that it is a great sin to tell one of the faithful that he is a pagan?" I spoke this with an earnest and resolute tone, and many of the congregation seemed gained over by it, and disposed to be favorable to me. The man replied that he was convinced we were not infidels, that he had persuaded no one to this pursuit, and as far as depended on him alone, he was ready to return to Siwa. As it turns out, Frendenberg had foolishly shown the men a document that Hornemann had received from Napoleon, and they demanded to know why he had it. Hornemann briefly returned to his tent to fetch these papers, and while doing so picked up his copy of the Koran. Frendenberg, having somewhat calmed down, would return with him to the interrogation. I immediately tendered the paper to a chief of the Siwans, who, having unfolded it, asked if any bystander could read it. I could not help smiling at the question, perilous as was my situation. The same question was then put to us, when I answered that we did not understand what it contained, but were told it would allow us to quit Cairo without being molested. "This is the book," interrupted my interpreter, "which I understand," and immediately took the Koran from my hand. We were ordered, by reading in it, to give proof of our being truly of the religion. Our learning in this respect went far indeed beyond the simple ability of reading. My companion knew the entire Koran by heart, and as for me, I could even then write Arabic, and well too, which with these people was an extraordinary proficiency in learning. We had scarcely given a sample of our respective talents, when the chiefs of our caravan, who to this moment had been silent, now took loudly our part, and many of the Siwans too interfered in our favor. In short, the inquiry ended to our complete advantage, though not without the murmuring of some in the multitude, who lost the hopes of plunder which the occasion might have afforded. Somehow, they had managed to survive this perilous situation completely unscathed. Hornemann must have been quite relieved, but would soon receive news that greatly dampened his spirits. In his state of panic, Frendenberg had feared that their bags would be searched, and had someone take Hornemann's mummified remains, mineral samples, and detailed notes, and throw them into a bog, from which they could never be recovered. Alas, there was nothing to do but to continue the journey. Soon, they arrived at the town of Mourzouk, belonging to nearby Augila. The families of many of the merchants lived here, who rushed out to embrace the relatives they believed had surely died during the French invasion. As the caravan planned to stay here for much longer than usual, Hornemann would proceed with 2 others to Augila. Augila, a town well known in the time of Herodotus, covers a space of about 1 mile in circumference. It is badly built, and the streets are narrow and not kept clean. The houses are built of a limestone, dug from the neighboring hills, and consist only of 1 story or ground floor. The apartments are dark, there being no aperture for light but the door, and are generally ranged round a small court, to which the entrance of each room faces, for the purpose of collecting the more light. This was the final town before a long stretch of empty desert, and so a messenger was sent ahead to ensure that the oases on their route held enough water. The caravan had grown at Augila. Merchants from the local area as well as Benghazi would accompany them to Fezzan, so that there were around 120 persons in total. The messenger returned with good news, and so the caravan made preparations to depart. Their next stop would be Temessa in the Kingdom of Fezzan. They were seen off by the people of Augila in the early morning, who pranced their horses and fired their muskets as a farewell. But just as soon as the caravan had left, they perceived that a number of men on horseback were charging towards them. The caravan drove their camels to high ground, and those with weapons armed themselves for the coming battle. To their relief, however, this was no gang of robbers, but instead the troops of the Bey of Benghazi who was staying in Augila. They had heard the gunshots and had rushed here to protect the caravan. With this misunderstanding cleared up, the caravan resumed their march into the expansive desert. In some places there was not a single blade of grass to feed the camels, and they would have to be fed from the caravan's own supplies. In other places they were met with steep mountain passes, so narrow they could only be traversed in a single file line. While crossing the desert, they passed quite a number of dead camels and donkeys that had been thoroughly plundered, sure signs that a band of robbers had been in the vicinity. They would later learn that these bandits had been lying in wait for the caravan, but assumed they had cancelled the journey after the invasion of Cairo. After a few days of travel, the caravan reached the dreaded Hartouj, an enormous volcanic field. The marvelous narratives of calamity therein suffered, and which had been recited to me on our way, and the black and dreary appearances which the face of the country offered to my view, roused my curiosity, and I pressed on before the caravan to examine a lower mountain, which, like a promontory, jutted towards us before the rest. Range upon range of dreary and black mountains succeed, and form the only prospect. We travelled between black and dreary hills, our road meandering through narrow and dismal ravines, now and then spreading to some width, having some grass and even a tree, and sometimes opening to a space of valley, of which the herbage looked fresh, and even luxuriant, from the copious rains which fall in this mountainous region, fertilizing the soil after it is washed down. 4 days were spent trudging through this desolate landscape, until they finally reached its end, returning to the endless desert. On this final stretch, Hornemann would spot a number of odd formations that by now he had become quite familiar with, large piles of calcinated shells. Some of these were so enormous that from a distance they appeared like giant pyramids, and more than once he was disappointed to discover their true identity. Nearly to Temissa, the caravan stopped at an oasis to gather water. Here, Hornemann happened to see an old man rushing towards the water, and offered him some dates and meat, which the man accepted with glee, kissing them and rubbing them on his forehead. Once he had spent quite some time drinking from the oasis, the man returned to Hornemann and told him of his plight. He was more than 60 years old, and was returning from a pilgrimage to Mecca. He claimed he had been 3 days without water. He traveled without any means of accommodation, food, or even water, and was making the journey like so many others, hoping to live on the charity of fellow Muslims. The following day, the caravan arrived at Temissa. They had finally reached the Kingdom of Fezzan. We were yet an hour's march distant from Temissa, when the inhabitants of that place greeted the caravan with welcome and congratulation on arrival. They put questions without number concerning our health, intermingling wishes for peace in the Arabian style and manner. The incessant repetition of the same words appeared to me extraordinary, but I was soon given to understand that it denoted polite manners, according to usage of the country. The more noble and educated the man, the oftener did he repeat his questions. A well-dressed young man attracted my particular attention. Accosting an Arab of Augila, he gave him his hand, and detained him a considerable time with his civilities. When the Arab being obliged to advance with greater speed to come up again with his companions, the youth of Fezzan thought he should appear deficient in good manners if he quitted him so soon. For near half a mile he kept running by his horse, whilst all his conversation was, "How dost thou fare? Well, how art thou thyself? God grant thee peace," etc. Temissa was a rather small town, with only around 40 soldiers to protect it, but it was nevertheless part of Fezzan, and from here Hornemann would begin to observe the conditions of the kingdom. According to Hornemann, Fezzan was bordered on the north by groups of Arabs. They were nominally part of Tripoli, but at any sign of weakness they would rebel. To the south lived the Tobo and Tuareg peoples, and beyond them was the Kingdom of Borno. Fezzan was said to have around 100 towns and villages in total. Its capital was the city of Mourzouk. Their primary produce was in dates. Herbs and vegetables were also quite common, while grain was imported from Arab countries to the north. There were very few livestock, and meat was treated as a sign of wealth. Consequently, Hornemann describes the people of Fezzan as being of a weak frame and having a dejected spirit. He claims to have not found a single skilled artificer in the whole country, and in fact that there were none at all besides shoemakers and smiths. The smiths had no specialization, and the same man who made shoes for the Sultan's horse would also make rings for his princesses. Surprisingly, the women of Fezzan were said to be somewhat freer than in other parts of the Muslim world. Hornemann observed that they would frequently dance in public, not only during the day, but even in the evening. The men of Fezzan were addicted to drunkenness, constantly imbibing lujibi or busa, drinks made from the sap and fruit of the date tree respectively. He describes the houses as being rather unsophisticated, as their construction and even the spreading of plaster were done with nothing but bare hands. These houses were also very low, and only lit by the light of their doorways. After a short journey, the caravan arrived at Zawila, a much larger town where many wealthy men, as well as some of the Sultan's own relatives, resided. As they made their preparations to enter, 20 men on white horses rode towards the caravan, followed by a large number of people on foot. The men were led by the town's sharif or mayor, a man called Hindi, and they were made up of his sons and relatives. They welcomed the caravan with a grand reception, cheering and firing their muskets. This hospitality was continued in the evening, when a slave of the Sharif brought each member of the caravan a soup with meat, as well as 10 small loaves of bread. After receiving an additional 3 loaves for breakfast, the caravan departed the following morning. On the journey to Mourzouk, Hornemann would have the chance to try some of Fezzan's local specialties. He describes lugibi, the drink made from date sap, as being rather refreshing and sweet, but unfortunately having a laxative effect. Hornemann would also be served a dish of locusts, which at first he was rather put off by, but as he grew accustomed to the flavor he began to enjoy it, describing it as a more delicious version of red herring. Eventually, the caravan reached the gates of Mourzouk, where the Sultan sat waiting for their arrival. Our caravan halted, and every person of the caravan, of any importance, dismounted to salute him. With others I approached, and found the Sultan seated on an old-fashioned elbow chair, round which soldiers were drawn up, but of mean appearance. The Sultan himself wore the Tripolitan vest, and over it a shirt or frock embroidered with silver. We entered the circle by an opening left facing the Sultan, and about the middle of the area we pulled off our slippers, and approached barefoot to kiss his imperial hand. Lastly entered the Sheikh of the Pilgrims, with his saber drawn, and kettle drum, and green flag of Mecca borne before him. The pilgrims followed, chanting praises to God, who had so far conducted them in safety, and continued their hymns until the Sultan was pleased to dismiss their leader, with a gracious promise of sending his royal present of dates and meat to every tent. This ceremony of audience being over, the Sultan remounted his horse and rode back to the city of Mourzouk, preceded by kettle drums and banners. His courtiers, joined by the Arabs of our caravan, pranced and curveted their horses on each flank of the procession. This man was Sultan Mohammed ben Sultan Mansur, a descendant of the Prophet Muhammad himself. The Sultan lived in the fortress of Mourzouk, which he shared with no one but his eunuchs. Rather than visiting their dwellings, the members of his harem would be brought to his room, which at this time consisted of a sultana of high status, as well as around 40 slaves, who were frequently sold or replaced if they could not bear children, or endear themselves to the Sultan in a different manner. His court consisted of a few free men, but white and black slaves held the majority of power. The city of Mourzouk itself served as a major hub for foreign trade. Merchants from Cairo brought silks and beads, from Benghazi tobacco and Turkish goods, and from the south came slaves, tiger skins, and gold. After conducting their business, the merchants of Hornemann's caravan made plans to depart for Sudan. Initially, he planned to go with them, but after learning that they may come under assault by the Tuareg, who were at war with Fezzan, Hornemann instead decided to wait for a caravan to come from Borno, which was quite close to his destination of the Niger. During this wait, both Hornemann and Frendenberg would catch a fever, from which only Hornemann would recover. After he had done so, he found that there were still quite a few months left before the caravan's arrival, and so Hornemann would travel to Tripoli to mail the current findings of his journey to the African Association. When he returned to Fezzan, he found that the caravan had arrived, and after making friends with the Sharif of Borno, Hornemann was allowed to travel with them to their country. Before his departure, Hornemann would write to the association for a final time, passing on in detail all the information he had thus far learned about the African interior. These few informations are the best that I have been able to collect on the interior of Africa. In this relation, I pass over men with tails, without necks, and without hair, without land, and living only in the Great Sea. It would be an easy matter for me to write you many letters on the interior state of Africa, but I might thereby convey information inaccurate or untrue. Besides, am I not returning to England? And if I do return, should I not reserve something new and interesting to plead my excuse for returning? If I do not perish in my undertaking, I hope in 5 years I shall be able to make the society better acquainted with the people, of whom I have given this short description. Signed, Friedrich Hornemann, 1798. Unfortunately, these letters were Hornemann's last. From here, he is known to have reached Borno, and is possibly the first European to have seen Lake Chad. A reliable source told the British consul that they saw him at Katsina, where he was, in good health and highly respected as a marabout, or Muslim teacher. From here, Hornemann traveled south, heading for the Niger. In 1801, in the village of Bolkani, Friedrich Hornemann would pass away from dysentery. He was just 20 miles from the River Niger. The story of Hornemann's incredible adventures in the African interior is one that will never be told. What remains is this: not since the time of the Romans was any other European known to have crossed the Sahara Desert. If you enjoyed this video, consider leaving a like. and subscribe to see my future content. If you found it interesting, you may also enjoy my video on Ponce de Leon and his search for the Fountain of Youth. As always, thanks for watching.